Hey everyone, I'm Brett Scott. I'm the author of Cloud Money and the Heretic's Guide to Global Finance. And in this 7-part series, I'm going to take you from the ground level of our economy all the way through up to the highest levels of global corporate capitalism. This has been made in collaboration with Lankelly Chase. This is part 6 of 7. So, let's begin. Now, the Buddhist fable of the blind men and the elephant tells the story of blindfolded sages who touch different parts of an elephant: tail, thigh, ear, leg, tusk, and trunk, and they imagine them to be a rope, a wall, a fan, a tree, a spear, and a snake. The moral is pretty simple. If you can't see or feel the bigger picture, you're going to imagine it as several smaller pictures. Now, similarly, as you navigate around the sub-vortices of corporate capitalism, you're going to experience them as these separate realms, and within these imagined separate realms, you're going to experience yourself as a series of different personas. For example, your consumer persona browses a supermarket shelf, which is an interface that hides hundreds of different underlying supply chains. And then later, your saver persona might think about their pension, which might be invested into numerous mutual funds that collectively invest into hundreds of corporations, which collectively own tens of thousands of underlying subsidiaries all over the world. Now, as your consumer persona picks up a carton of soya milk, they're going to be totally unaware that somewhere else in the system, your saver persona might be indirectly invested in companies that supply the firm that they're about to buy a product from. Our view of our system is basically fragmented. Each of those sub-markets or sub-vortices that we move through, each seems to have its own discrete logic, as it were. Now, to understand this more clearly, we actually need to travel to the different vantage points in our system and to look at the world through the eyes of the persona or group that resides there. So let's go through 4 of these viewpoints, starting with the view from the financial sector. The world through the eyes of finance. So, when a financier is looking out on corporate capitalism, they see it from a very specific angle. Through their eyes, the world is often rendered as a series of price charts and graphs. For example, suppliers and workers are just numbers that appear on a company income statement as expenses that detract from profits. Now, through the eyes of finance, minimizing these expenses is seen as positive, which means financiers will often want managers to drive down wages and cut corners with suppliers. Also, through this worldview, consumers or customers are not seen as people trying to survive, but rather as an abstract collective that will give rise to future revenue. So, when deciding whether to invest or not, an investor might create a thought experiment in which they try to guess how much the consumers will buy in future, and then set that against the expected expenses of workers and suppliers. They can then put the results of that through a discounted cash flow analysis to give them a theoretical price for the shares. They can then compare that to the actual price to see if these shares are good value or overvalued. Now, when making these projections, investors are not only going to be imagining what potential returns they may get in future, they're also going to be setting that against potential risks. Now, this leads to what's called a risk-return mentality. If they have to back a risky venture, they want a higher return. Now, through this lens, they'll get agitated if they're not making enough profit relative to the risk they're taking on, or if they're making less profit than they could somewhere else for the same amount of risk, or if they sense distant, unquantifiable threats like future government regulations, worker activism, or consumer boycotts, which might destabilize their projections. Now, they're going to get upset if they make absolute losses, and this can occur if things go badly at a company. But it can also occur if there's simply a change of sentiment in the financial market that drives down share prices that were previously based on unrealistic projections. In a sense, shareholders are betting on a whole range of unpredictable interactions between the different sub-vortices in our picture, which basically means share prices can easily bake in unrealistic dreams about things that won't actually end up happening. This means that many losses that occur in stock markets stem from the loss of those dreams or the bursting of bubbles. The world through the eyes of managers. Now, the concerns of financiers impact the perspective of senior corporate managers, who are the ones who are technically hired by shareholders to run these big corporations. Now, in the capitalist system, profit emerges if input costs are lower than output revenues. So to reduce the former, managers might seek to drive down wages of workers or dominate over suppliers. They might even play those parties off against each other by replacing or threatening to replace workers with machines that they buy from the bosses of other businesses. This is what we call automation. At the same time, they actually might face pressures to keep stability, and that may involve trying to reward loyal workers or to grant suppliers long-term contracts to keep them aligned. And basically, this flexibility emerges because cutting costs is only one way to make profit in a capitalist system. The other means is to actually boost your revenues relative to your costs, and businesses will try to do this by breaking into new markets or capturing more consumers via marketing, hence our world being saturated with corporate messaging. Tech companies, for example, will grant very high salaries to their elite workers precisely because they know that they can make huge revenues by capturing the public and the platforms that those workers will end up building. Now, in many ways, managers are sandwiched between shareholders on the one hand and workers on the other, but they're contractually required to prioritize the interests of the former, prioritize the interests of shareholders. But their workers might be scattered across the globe in distant operations in Nigeria or Australia, for example. And each country that they operate in might have separate union laws, environmental regulations, or lack thereof, and labor conditions. So in many ways, being a senior manager in a transnational corporation is inherently geopolitical. Managers might be involved in cutting tax deals with different governments or lobbying against new policies that may affect them, all while trying to suppress worker unions. Here's a consulting company that literally offers services to do that. The world through the eyes of workers. So the big shareholders and senior managers of companies will often like to claim that they create jobs, as if they were handing out some kind of charity. In reality, though, the people sitting around the corporate boardrooms in London or New York make nothing unless workers actually operate their assets. They create jobs because, well, workers operate the assets that create the products that lead to the revenues that lead to the profits that managers and shareholders want. They create jobs in much the same way that a beekeeper creates jobs for bees. I mean, the beekeeper's not doing it out of charity. The beekeeper does it because they want the bees to produce honey for them. Now, many workers don't think like this, though. They're often actually in a weaker position, and they lack access to capital, and they have smaller buffers of money to survive on. This actually means that they might indeed feel grateful if they can secure a job operating corporate assets, or to use that beekeeper metaphor, to find a hive. Now, many of us know what it's like to be an employee. Workers will face pressure from bosses telling them what to do. They might hear whispers about elusive shareholders who they don't directly speak to. They may face a lack of job security alongside discrimination, racism, sexism, etc. Now, they're often the ones who are directly actually making the goods and services that consumers will be buying, or the ones who will serve those customers. But they'll also often sense that their bosses actually have more allegiance to those customers than they do to them. For example, in the service industry, they may find themselves reprimanded by a middle manager who tells them that the customer is always right. Given that the managers and shareholders are often not prepared to lower their own slice of the pie, any demands for increases in wages on the part of workers will often be decried and criticized by managers, and they'll say that they'll have to pass these costs on to the consumer. So if workers do actually secure a higher wage, they might then get blamed for contributing to a rising cost of living for other people. Now, this could actually be solved if managers and shareholders just took a lower cut. But managers are scared that if they reduce the shareholder returns, the fickle investors would back away. Now, not only do workers face pressures from all sides, but they're often actually forced to battle each other. They may fear other workers who are competing for positions to work the same assets, and this can bleed into xenophobic fears around immigration or fears of foreign outsourcing. Now, in the 1990s, there were these major waves of globalization in which big corporates started firing their local workers and delegating the role to foreign suppliers. You might note right now, for example, that the US Trump administration is pushing out a lot of rhetoric about rewiring that international integration in various ways. The world through the eyes of consumers. So the world of the consumer is the world of commodity fetishism, which is this state of being in which objects appear before us on shelves or on Amazon.com pages, divorced from their underlying origins. They just appear as these floating objects in space, disconnected from ecological systems and from the armies of workers and factories that produce them. For example, this man will not be aware of the transnational labor networks behind the oil that his fuel is derived from. He also won't know that the same oil company might actually supply the oil used for the plastics in the lid of his takeaway coffee. Now, this man actually may very well get irritated if there are minor disruptions to fuel through strikes. But even if he recognizes worker struggles and the validity of worker struggles around the world, he probably won't feel like he can do anything about it. After all, his own survival in the economy requires him to continue using things like coffee and cars and other common inputs that are required to keep up with everyone else. He may be under pressure and feeling the pinch of the cost of living. So even if he's actually aware that somewhere down the line, a community in the Niger Delta, for example, is rising up against an oil giant that's polluting their environment, he's probably just going to default to doing what he has to do, which is to buy the fuel and don't think about it. Ouroboros capitalism. So, the market vortex is actually a series of sub-vortices and complex interaction. It's very important to stress, though, that far from being some kind of harmonious system working in pure symbiosis, capitalism actually contains deep contradictions and actually frequently attacks itself. In fact, the image that comes to mind is of the Ouroboros, the snake that eats its own tail. Now, these contradictions can actually be glimpsed if you go to any point in our system and follow the connections along a winding path. For example, different shareholders might demand higher profits, but that might require consumers to spend more and for workers to get paid less. But workers are consumers, so if they paid less, they can't spend more. So you might find yourself in a part of the system where you're paid too little as a worker while being worried about the cost of living as a consumer. So you might seek to compensate by trying to make money in stock markets as an investor. So you go and you try to buy shares in companies that are run by managers that believe they must boost profits by paying workers less while charging consumers more. One class that you're now part of, the financial investor class, seeks to benefit from the suppression of two other classes you're also part of, the worker and the consumer class. In a sense, you're potentially at war with yourself in this situation. So basically, there are all these kind of cross-cutting currents in our system and this constant angst, as if the system is trying to rip itself apart. And there are at least three meta problems that emerge through this. 1. Social injustice. There's constant pressure in our system to make workers do more for less and to extract as much from them as possible. This doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is miserable in our system all the time and that work is necessarily always overtly exploitative. But at a meta level, it does mean that there's this constant process of extraction that's always contributing to a growing inequality between extractors and extractees. Some people do get to actually have exciting and fulfilling jobs. For example, software engineers who are currently having a lot of fun building big AI systems that will make venture capitalists rich. But billions of others must often scrape by with menial jobs. So returns in the system are heavily unequal, and frequently the most vital and foundational types of roles and jobs get paid the least. For example, the people who actually extract the minerals required for your mobile phone. 2. Ecological destruction. In many ways, consumers are exploited too through the ideology of consumerism. But regardless of whether you think having lots of stuff is good for you or not, there is absolutely no denying that having lots of stuff requires exploiting the earth. Ecological destruction turns up all over our system. We find it in production processes themselves, because every act of production has a real resource cost. One thing is transformed into another, e.g., trees are transformed into logs, and logs are transformed into planks, and planks are turned into tables. So every act of production in our system is simultaneously an act of destruction of something else. But production also creates these byproducts, which we call waste, which often get discarded and turn up as pollution. We also find this in consumption processes. As a good reaches the end of its life, it too gets discarded, or elements of it get discarded. 3. Mentality and vibe. Our system also actually produces huge amounts of inauthenticity and toxic social values and unbalanced ways of being and thinking. Basically, we're supposed to submit ourselves to endless disciplined work in order to endlessly and hedonistically consume. So on this production side, we're pushed towards domination and militaristic efficiency impulses. We're told that informal, peer-to-peer, horizontal social arrangements are inefficient, and that it's much better to formalize everything into vast corporate and state bureaucracies. People are pushed to endlessly produce, regardless of whether what's being produced truly makes us happy. And on this consumption side, we're pushed towards accumulation, addiction, and dependence often. We are often infantilized by paternalistic and inauthentic marketing. We're told that being resilient and self-sufficient is anti-progress, and that we should be fawning for goods and becoming dependent on vast corporations. You're encouraged to wallow in a kind of individualized culture of political apathy and to ignore calls for solidarity between people. We're told to fawn over the act of exchange, the act of formal exchange between producer and consumer. Now, one of the core critiques of capitalism is that the market, where these two sides meet, is often foregrounded as the center of life and the whole point of human existence, rather than something that's a peripheral means to serve human existence. In fact, we often start to commodify ourselves. As we saw earlier, we all have a spectrum of different natures within us. Now, in a market society, those different parts of ourselves, Homo communis or Homo ecologicus, can themselves become objects of commodification. Instagram, for example, pushes us to mine informational commodities, i.e. photos, videos, etc., from situations where informal reciprocity and everyday communism used to rule, such as hanging out with friends or having dinner with your family. Now, these commodities are then pushed into an attention marketplace in order to capture eyeballs for corporate advertising. So this sense that commodification pervades every aspect of being is strong. And this domination of our spirit is what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, which is the sense that there's no other possible way of being that is conceivable. It's that feeling that your actions to change the system are futile, like pushing on a string, and that capitalism is a kind of unstoppable and totally immersive system with no outside to it. Now, regardless of whether this perception reflects something real or not, it's a very powerful feeling and a very powerful problem for anyone who attempts to articulate a different system. So, in the final part of the series, we're going to go into some different paths that we can take towards a better future. See you then.